I'm David Nelson, the Money Runner. This is our second podcast, but already we're going to make some changes. We're going to talk about one thing tonight and one thing only. We're going to talk about inflation and high prices and what it means to you and your family. So let's go. All right, so like I said, we're going to talk about inflation, but that's only one of the problems that we've had this year. Already, 2022 has been pretty challenging, I think, for most of us. For some of you, certainly in my business, stocks have been getting hit. The economy, we're starting to see early signs of a breakdown in the economy starting to slow down. Certainly earlier in the year, we had a war in Ukraine. And when was the last time you talked about a nuclear event? And we had one actually this year. I think when a Russian soldier fires a projectile at a nuclear power plant, that's something of a nuclear event. So we've had a lot to deal with. But maybe bigger than all of that is the divide in the country that surrounds us when we deal with politics. We can't seem to, there is no middle anymore. There's no middle ground anymore. We seem to identify not just our friends and neighbors and our business associates, sometimes even members of our family, by who they voted for in the last election. And the problem with that is, without having a middle ground, there's very little room for debate, and we can't solve these very, very difficult problems that we're going to discuss tonight and discuss in the future. The ability to solve these problems is only going to come about if we can somehow meet in the middle and have some kind of consensus. All right, so let's pivot to the topic at hand. And that was inflation and the high prices that I discussed earlier. I think it goes without saying inflation hits us all, but it really hits those at the bottom of the economic pyramid, probably the worst. Those that we want to help the most are sometimes getting hit the hardest. And it's because it's a bigger part of their discretionary income. When prices rise in the local grocery or prices rise at a local gas station, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, that can be a big hit. Now, there's certainly a lot of causes for higher inflation. Certainly the Federal Reserve, the FOMC, they certainly played a role. And in fact, I would go as far to say that what we had last was probably a policy mistake. I think Jay Powell, I think he means well, but I think by and large, his administration as Fed chair has been problematic at best. I think they've made some fairly large errors, and we're starting to pay for that now. I think they did not raise interest rates quickly enough, and they kept money flowing through the system far too long. And now we have some of this inflation that we're dealing with right now. It's not the only thing. There are certainly other factors out there. We're coming out of COVID. That was a factor. China is shut down. That raises prices. That's a factor as well. And you can bet Washington, they don't get a pass on this either. And we're going to be talking about the leader of the Democratic Party and the leader in Washington, who's of course our president, President Biden. We're going to dedicate a whole show to the massive waste in government spending that your hard-earned dollars and what you can do about it. But the top of the list, when we're talking about inflation and the rise in prices that you're paying, the top of anyone's list has to be the rising energy and oil prices that we're seeing around the world. But it's so much more than what you just pay at the pump. All right, I get that's pretty scary when you see prices go above $4. Here in Connecticut, where I live, in some place, certain grades of gasoline, it's above $5. But think about energy in a larger mindset than that. Energy touches everything. And if you're a company, it touches every line item of the income statement. It raises the cost to manufacture the product. It raises the cost to get it to you, the transportation costs. So I don't care whether you're an industrial complex, whether you're running a small business, or you're just driving to and from work. These higher energy prices are really affecting your bottom line, and it affects the way you live. It affects the way you approach life. It affects the way you you spend your money. You're going to spend less because you're worried about how high prices might be in the future. You're going to need more capital. It affects us all. And what that translates into is reduced economic activity here in the United States, which eventually, unfortunately, will likely lead to recession. And my call on this has been that we'll probably hit a recession sometime late this year, perhaps early next year. But before we go into energy, what's being done wrong, and what we can do about it, I think we got to take a step back and look at another point in time where we had a crisis, maybe a little worse than the one we have right now. And that was in 1973, the 1973 oil crisis. It was also known as the oil embargo. Now, I know a lot of you out there watching this show, you're younger than I am, and you probably don't even remember it. Maybe some of you were sitting in the back seat of your dad's station wagon, and you kind of remember some of what I'm talking about now. I remember back then, the long gas lines. That was pretty problematic. But how did that oil embargo started? I actually learned something when I started putting this show together, this episode together. I actually thought that back then that Saudi Arabia and other OPEC nations, I thought they raised prices just simply because they could get away with it. And it was really much deeper than that. What I learned when I went back and studied the history, that it was really payback. They were coming back hard on the United States and other countries that had supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. And it was their opportunity to get back at the United States. It was a hard hit. Within 5 months, the price of oil rose 300%, 3 times, from $3 to $19 on the world stage. And here in the United States, the prices were much higher than that. What was even more frightening is when you actually got up to the pump, there was likely, somebody standing there with a shotgun or probably some other weapon, and his job was just to keep order. That's how serious it was. People were so desperate, to get fuel, to get gasoline for their cars, that sometimes violence ensued. And over the next 35 years, the United States and other developed nations around the world paid the price of an OPEC cartel-like structure that they wielded their power with an iron fist. And we paid that price. We had a very rough decade in the 1970s, and is the reason we're even having this talk right now in this discussion, because this inflation that we're feeling, and we're feeling it everywhere, we're so afraid of going back to what took place in the 1970s and the 1980s. We want to do something about it. So we lived under that threat for the next 35 years. And then technology comes and saves the day. It came in the form of a technology called fracking. And fracking is just simply where they push fluid back down into the well and take a well that had stopped producing oil or natural gas, and suddenly it becomes alive again, right? And it took wells that had become not economic to operate, and suddenly they were economic again, and we could get fluid out of there. Now, it's controversial at best. There are certainly pros and cons to fracking, and that's a debate that we should have. We should look at other ways to extract this fuel from out of the ground. But it's certainly, one thing is for certain, it certainly helped us out in the last 10, 15 years. Now, we can debate whether or not the United States was energy independent and whether or not fracking was a good thing. But what isn't up for debate is the fact that we had increased economic activity and it provided more jobs here in the United States and less economic uncertainty. Now, make no mistake about it, we're transitioning, all right? The world is transitioning. Without question, the world is on a path to move to alternative energy. I'm certainly in favor of that. There are a lot of ways that could happen. There are a lot of alternative energy projects that are out there. The problem is that it's been pushed on us, perhaps without thinking of the economic consequences of just shutting off the spigot of fossil fuel. By rushing too soon, you can't have a world of wind and solar and hydroelectric when it's not ready to do the task, when it's not ready to scale. That's the problem. So any rational view of a greener society has really got to include an all of the above approach: wind, solar, geothermal, hydroelectric, nuclear, and of course, oil and natural gas. This is really the Achilles heel of the Democratic Party. And this is where the Democrats in the last number of years have really gone off the rails. And as the leader of that party, I think President Biden bears some responsibility here. I think we should look at the statements that he's made just since he was president, right? Came into office January 20th. First thing he did, hadn't been in office 4 hours yet, was to revoke the approval for the Keystone Pipeline. Think about it. Right? By doing that, he really sent a message to the energy complex. You're not going to be able to transport your oil. That was step one. Same day, the very same day, a moratorium on oil and gas leasing on federal lands and waters. That drives up the price at the pump. It drives up the cost of energy. It drives up that oil price. Today it closed somewhere between $116, $117. We can't live with oil at that level without having inflation. A month later, February 26, changes how the social costs are measured. Now, I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but they were jacked up so much it had to increase the cost of energy even further as oil companies had to deal with the problem. Maybe there's a time for that, but when we're in the middle of an energy crisis and an inflationary spiral, maybe this is not the moment. June 1st, just about a year ago, eliminated many of the tax benefits for oil and gas companies in favor of electric vehicles as part of a $6 trillion budget. This one, I really don't have a problem with this one, all right? I'm not really in favor of tax benefits. I don't care what the industry is. This is a wonderful device. We all have one probably, an iPhone. If we had tax benefits, for Apple in developing the cell phone, rather the iPhone, we'd probably be looking at something the size of a World War II walkie-talkie because the competition wouldn't have ensued. Let economics play their role. They'll get the job done. August 11th, all right, calls on OPEC to increase supply. Now, this is a place that we went to war several times. We've lost a lot of American lives there. Certainly the first Gulf War, that was about oil, right? Iraq had attacked Kuwait, an oil producer, and the United States, of course, stepped in. And probably a big part of our geopolitical and foreign policy, in one way or another, has been dedicated to a region of the world that really doesn't like us that much, right? So he calls OPEC. They don't even pick up the phone. Right? He doesn't turn to our own energy complex and say, guys, I need some help. He went to them first. So that was kind of telling. October 29th, Biden and the Democrats propose an increased methane fee. All right. I'm sure there's a time and a place for that, but we're driving up prices even further by doing that. November 17th, this one's kind of my favorite, sends a letter to the FTC encouraging investigation on oil and gas companies and retail prices. It's the guy at the gas station. It's your retail gas station that's driving up the prices at the pump, not the fact that oil is surging and they're forced to raise those prices to make ends meet, right? March 12th, Democrats propose to tax top U.S. oil producers with a windfall profits tax. Of course, they're going to make more money when the price of oil goes up. Take that money away. But at the same time, they turn back to these guys and say, we need you to put more money into the ground. How can they put the money into the ground and get more oil out if you're increasing the tax rate on them? Doesn't make sense. It's not sound policy. March 21st, Biden's Secretary of Energy proposes a landmark climate rules change. I'm sure, again, there's a time for this, but this is not the moment. This is just simply not the moment. And at the same time, they're saying that they're going to get their act together to supply more natural gas to Europe, our allies. Well, what about us? All right. I get that there's a crisis over there, but we're having a crisis right here in the United States. And if we don't arrest this situation, it's going to get ugly pretty fast. Now, finally, before he even became president. This one is probably the most important because this really set the stage, not just for his election and what he wanted to accomplish and who he stood for as an individual, but really the general policy of the Democratic Party and probably what they pushed forth through most of the first part of this administration. As early as 2019, while running for president in New Hampshire, he looked voters in the eye and he promised to end the fossil fuel industry. He didn't say just we're going to raise prices, we're going to turn to alternative energy. He said we're going to end the fossil fuel energy. So once the Ukraine war breaks out, the president has a change of heart and he starts turning to the same industry executives he threw under the bus. Now, the mindset has got to shift, all right? We're going to have to work together as a nation to solve this problem, all right? You can't put out sound bites that just cater to your base without having a bona fide plan in place. His last effort to do anything about this couldn't be more political. He released 1 million barrels a day. He made that announcement about 6 weeks ago. 1 million barrels a day would be released from the SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, to help bring down the price of oil, at least put a cap on it. It hasn't worked at all. Oil is pretty close to all-time highs at this point. But let's examine that. Let's tear it apart. From the day he made that announcement, if you count forward 180 days, pretty much takes you right up to just before the November midterm elections. It was a money grab. It was buying votes. He's trying to hold the prices down a little bit to help people get elected from his party. So bottom line, any talk you're hearing from the administration regarding what they're calling peak inflation, right? Meaning that this is it. It's not going to get any worse and it's only going to get better from here. Any talk of peak inflation really can't take place until we at least arrest energy prices where they are. They got to at least stop going up. If in fact they probably got to come down as well. Unfortunately, what can the president do? He passes these executive orders. That's something he does, and that certainly hurt in the first part of the administration, but they don't have a lasting effect. An executive order is just that. It's something the president can do, and as quickly as it goes in, when the next administration comes in, it can be turned off. When he came in, he undid a fair number of President Trump's executive orders. Can't run policy that way. Certainly not something as important as an energy policy. Energy policy has to come from Congress, and it's for the following reason. Energy companies, and I don't care if you're a fossil fuel company or an alternative energy company with projects that span more than a decade often, right? You cannot plan ahead if you have no idea what the regulatory environment is going to be in the next 4, 5, 6 years. You're not going to invest hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars on a project to change your footprint, something that's going to go on long beyond where the president is going to, that president his administration is going to exist. Congress needs to do it because they'll codify it into law, and there again has a life of its own. It's very difficult to just undo the law. So you can play a role as well. It's call to action. Do something about it. Make sure your voice is known. Write to your senators, write to your congressmen, write to your local officials about what you think. If you think the policy isn't right, don't wait to just the next election to do something about it. Make your voice known now. They read that stuff. And believe me, when enough letters come in and they're not in line with those letters, what they're saying, they panic and they do something about it. All right. We covered, probably a lot of ground today. We probably laid out the problem pretty well. I don't know if that we came up with any solutions. Maybe the biggest solution we can come up with is really taking a step back and figuring out how we can at least have a dialogue, how we can sit and hammer these things out and meet someplace in the middle. You know, the truth rarely lives on the extremes. It usually resides somewhere in the middle. Think about that over the next week. So thanks so much for joining. This was our second podcast. I hope you'll join us again next week. If, of course, something breaks between now and then, I'll be sure to break in and cover it. Again, thanks for joining. I'm David Nelson.